Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are around the world. Thank you and welcome to another episode of the Silk Stocking Sisters podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Teresa Canada, and I have today another special guest. As you all know, all my guests are special. So I wanted you to understand that I have another special guest with us today to talk about experiences in what she's going to share about her book and things that she's been involved in that I think are pertinent to this particular podcast. And my guest's name is Stephanie Deutsch, and she's the author of the book titled You Need a Schoolhouse, Booker T. Washington, Julius, Rosenwald, and the Building of Schools for the Segregated South. And I want to welcome Stephanie to my podcast. Welcome, Stephanie.
Hi there. It's so nice to be here.
Good. Now, I have to tell the story to everybody. You know, I have a story for everything. My guest speaker, I would say, what's Dr. Cat talk about now? I have a story, how I met Stephanie. I met Stephanie in 2019, and we shared a table at a book exhibit. We both were authors, and we were sharing a table. And so I looked at her book. I thought, oh, this is interesting. I know a little bit about this, because I have a cousin who was a Black woman who was a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse in North Carolina. And it was fascinating. I said, now this book talks about the schools that were built throughout the South. I said, this is fantastic. So I purchased the book and she autographed it for me. And we were at the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. I think that was called SALA. I think that's the acronym. But that's where we met in 2019. And I read a book. Of course, I read her book, and I was starting this podcast, and I thought later on, who else can I invite? I said, oh, let me contact Stephanie. She might be of interest, even though the experience is about the South. But the fact is, the person who was initiating those special schools, Rosenwald schools, was from Chicago. So I think that this is a really interesting way in which to segue in terms of how her research is done, her writings, what she's doing, even now that she can share with the audience. So Stephanie, let's start out with the story that you shared with me earlier. We talked about briefly.
About my childhood.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Teresa. It's so nice to be with you. I think it's fascinating to realize how recent in history segregation is. When I was a child, I lived in Arlington, Virginia, which is Northern Virginia. It's a suburb of Washington, D.C. And I was startled to read in the paper here in D.C. recently about a physical wall that exists. Pieces of this wall exist in Arlington, and this wall separated Arlington, where I lived, North Arlington, from a neighborhood called Halls Hill, which is where Black people lived.
Okay.
And I went to a elementary school that when I was there, I started first grade in 1953, was entirely white. And it never occurred to me that there were African-American children living just practically a stone's throw from where I was, and that they were going to their schools and we were going to ours.
Wow.
I moved away because of my father's work. And when we came back in the early 60s, and my sisters went to the local high school, there was a Black child in their high school class. And that was sort of a thing of note. So yeah, this is an experience.
This was a high school level when they finally had a student in the class that was Black.
Yes. When my sister was starting high school.
Wow. Okay. But see, people think it's just like, it was always okay, but it's, we're evidence that it did occur. Our experiences are valid. So thank you for sharing that story, because it's really, what, people think of what? It's unbelievable. And like I said before, there are some people who will be preparing to be teachers who are completely unaware of, some of the things that were happening, how people didn't really it wasn't like just yesterday, it was like a while ago. It's recent in a sense that people didn't sit in the same classrooms. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think that was an important story to share, because I think it kind of adds on to the purposes of my podcast, sharing these stories and people to know some of the historical perspectives that are taking place and have taken place even recently that people are completely unaware of. But thank you for sharing that. So let me just also continue my description of Stephanie's background. Stephanie is a writer and critic living in Washington, D.C. She has written for the New York Times, the Weekly Standard, the Millions blog, the Washington Times, and neighborhood newspapers. She edited and wrote the introduction to Capitol Hill, Beyond the Monuments, a book of photographs published in 1996 by the Capitol Hill Arts Workshop. Currently, Stephanie is on the board of the campaign to create the Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Historic Park. Since the publication of her book, she has visited many schools and spoken at several conferences all across the country. So having had this background, Stephanie, talk about your book and how it came about, and fill us in about the relationship that existed between Mr. Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington.
Yeah, well, wow, that's a lot. But I'll start with the book. I had been a stay-at-home mom with my kids and doing all the things that stay-at-home moms do. And I was starting to do some writing, freelance writing, and I decided I wanted to write a biography. And it happens that my husband is a great-grandson of Julius Rosenwald. And so one of his cousins said to me, well, would you think about writing something about Julius Rosenwald? And so I learned a little bit about him, and I learned that he was president of Sears. But I thought, I don't know, a businessman. I like Sears. I understand that, but I don't really think I could write about that. Well, I did a little more research, and I discovered that one of the foundational experiences of Julius Rosenwald's life was meeting Booker T. Washington in 1911.
Oh, wow.
And more...
Let's pause. Tell the audience about who Booker T. Washington is, because many people don't know about Booker T. Washington.
Well, that is true. And to be honest, Teresa, I was a little shocked at my own ignorance when this started. I, of course, recognized the name.
Right.
And I, of course, recognized the name Tuskegee.
Right.
Couldn't get too far beyond that.
Okay.
So Booker T. Washington had been, born in 1856 in Virginia, actually, the western part of the state of Virginia. His birthplace is now a National Park Service site that you can visit, which I have visited. Anyway, he was a child of 9. He was emancipated at the end of the Civil War and went on to live in West Virginia and just craved education because, of course, enslaved children were completely deprived of education. It was the law, you
could teach an enslaved person to read. Right, exactly.
And there's a story he writes in Up from Slavery that I find just so touching. As a small boy, one of his jobs was to ride on the back of the horse with the daughter of the family that he was enslaved by, because she was a teacher. And he would ride on the back of the horse with her, and his job was to bring the horse back so it could work in the fields. But he wrote in Up from Slavery that he would get to the schoolhouse and she'd go inside and he'd get off the horse and go up and stand on tiptoes to look in the window of the school. And he said he saw the desks and the maps and the books and the children, and he said it looked like paradise because it was something he was excluded from.
Oh, wow.
And so he longed for education. And finally, again, he writes about this in Up from Slavery. He was working in a coal mine, and he heard 2 miners talking about how, hey, there's this school. It's for Black people. You don't have to pay to go there. And he writes that he crept closer to them to try to hear what was the name of the school. And he heard that it was Hampton, which, of course, now is Hampton University. But Hampton had been established by the Freedmen's Bureau at the end of the war to educate teachers, African-American teachers. And so he did manage to go there. And he graduated. He was first in his class when he graduated. And you might remember this in my book. There's a picture of him at his graduation. And it's a wonderful picture because he looks both extremely proud, as you would if you were first in your class, and a little anxious about what lies ahead.
What next? Right.
Yeah, what next? Which a feeling we all can identify with to some extent, but in his case, it was even more so. So a few years later, the state of Alabama decided to set up a school like Hampton to educate people to be teachers. And they asked, I love this detail, they asked the white principal of Hampton to please recommend a well-qualified white man. And he wrote back to them and said, I'm sending you Booker T. Washington. I know of no white man who could do better. So, age 25, Booker T. Washington goes down to rural Alabama, about 40 miles east of Montgomery,
Mhm.
And he has this small stipend from the state of Alabama to set up a school. And it turns out he's really kind of a genius. I mean, he is a very good organizer,
Mhm.
and he organizes this school. And he also turns out to be a very good fundraiser.
Mhm.
And he does a lot of traveling up north and speaking to groups and getting donations. And Tuskegee becomes quite successful, and it attracts people, male and female. Anyone can go there. You can work your way through. The students learned trades as
Right.
well as academic subjects, and so the campus is that. Have you ever been there? It's
Oh,
beautiful.
that's right then.
Well, it's beautiful, and the buildings, the students actually made the bricks
Yes.
that the buildings are
Yes.
made of right there
Masonry. That's
on
right.
the campus, and they built the buildings and the carpentry and all that. And so it's a remarkable place. And he became really the best known African American of his generation,
Yes.
widely respected and admired.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. Yes. So,
and
so tell us about a little about the Rosenwald schools and, a little bit about Mr. Rosenwald.
So Mr. Rosenwald was a little bit younger. He was born his parents were Jewish immigrants from Germany.
Mhm.
His parents came to this country for the reason immigrants always do, for a better life, for more opportunity. But in his case, because they were Jewish, they were also fleeing anti-Semitism
Mhm.
and just severe lack of Jews were not allowed to own land. They were not allowed to
Right.
go to university. So it was a very restricted life. So his parents came to this country. His father started as a peddler, as many Jewish immigrants did. And by the time Julius was born, they were running a clothing store in Springfield, Illinois.
Okay.
So Julius was born there, and he grew up in a house right across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home. Lincoln wasn't there at the time, of course, but anyway, he learned the clothing trade from members of his family. Never graduated from high school, but learned the clothing trade. Yeah, when he was 16, his parents sent him to New York to be apprenticed to his uncles to
Okay.
learn the clothing business.
Right.
And in 1895, he had the opportunity to buy into a small, unknown mail order company called Sears Roebuck. And he wrote in a memoir that it took him 5 minutes to decide, yeah, mail order is a business with a future, because the population, was largely rural. People had no access to stores.
Right.
The postal system is improving, train communication is improving. And so he was right. He for a small investment in Sears, by the time he was 45, he was a very, very, very rich man.
Yes.
And so he had been brought up, very steeped in Jewish teaching. And so he knew that he felt his responsibility, if he had more than he needed, was to use it to assist others. And this was tzedakah, a very foundational principle of Judaism.
Mhm.
And it was interesting that he started with Jewish causes, Jewish hospitals and things in Chicago. But one thing that caught his interest and turned his thoughts towards African Americans was that in 1908, there was a huge race riot in his hometown, Springfield, Illinois. And this is just at the time that he and other American Jews are raising money to send to victims of pogroms in Europe. This, state-sanctioned violence against Jews that many, his own parents had come to this country to get away from.
Right.
And he really made a connection. And he thought, this is not going to work for anyone, and we're not going to be able to create a viable country if a significant portion of our population is despised and left behind.
Mhm.
So he was, yeah. And so about this time, he was asked to donate in Chicago to the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association.
Yeah.
And he said, no, I'll leave that to my Christian brothers to donate to the YMCA. And then he said, but if you decide to open a YMCA for African Americans, come back and see me again. Because, the Y back then was not just gym. It was a place where people could stay. It was a It was housing. It was
Housing. Yeah, housing.
And especially for Black people, they couldn't stay at hotels. They had no place to stay. So I love
Now,
this.
give people a frame of reference. People will say that. What are you talking about? What time period was this? And then
We're now 1910.
Okay.
1910. Julius is in Chicago, and I would love to have seen this event. The leaders of the Black YMCA then came to him and said, okay, you said you were interested in starting a Black YMCA in Chicago. Would you be willing to make a donation? And he said, yes, I'll donate $25,000 if the African-American community can raise 75, or the community, Black and white, can raise $75,000. And then he totally shocked them by saying, and I'll do this for any city in America. So as a result of that, 27 cities, Atlanta, DC, Brooklyn, among them,
yes,
had Black YMCAs, which were hugely important places for socializing and a safe haven, really.
Right. A safe place to go together.
A safe place to go together. So this kind of put him on everyone's radar screen as, ooh, this guy is wealthy and he's generous. And so he was just the kind of man that Booker T. Washington liked
to connect with, right?
Yeah, I wanted to connect with. So the next year, Washington was in Chicago. The two men met, and Rosenwald hosted actually a luncheon to introduce Booker T. Washington to a lot of people. And then, again, this is something where I wish I could have been a fly on the wall to see this, but he took Booker T. Washington to Sears, and they had lunch in the executive dining room where
unbelievable, right?
Yeah, no Black man had ever been before.
Exactly. Like I said, unbelievable. I mean, you think of it now like, oh, okay, no big deal. But that was a time when
back then it was. And there's even a story about I guess when they rode out to Sears, Julius Rosenwald had his chauffeur drive them. And his chauffeur said, well, I don't want to drive a Black man. And Rosenwald said, well, then I'll get someone else. But and the chauffeur said, well, you mean you're going to ride with him in the car? And Rosenwald said, yeah. So Booker T. Washington invited Julius to join the board of Tuskegee. Mm-hmm. And Julius said, I have to see it before I can join the board. So he and a group of people from Chicago, including his rabbi from his temple, Jane Addams, who was a big, Schoolhouse. She was on that first trip. They went down to Tuskegee. They saw the campus. They heard the students sing. And Julius was like totally hooked.
Right. Overwhelmed with this. Like, oh, wow. Okay.
A story I love to tell is that shortly after that, Washington comes back to Chicago and he's a house guest at Julius Rosenwald's house.
At his home.
And I had the opportunity to interview Rosenwald's youngest child. By the time I interviewed him, he was a man in his 90s.
Right.
At the time of this visit, he was 11, or no, actually, I think he was 9 years old. And he told me that, so Booker T. Washington comes, and I said, oh my gosh, what did you think of him? And he said, well, I didn't really think anything about him, but I wondered why he and my father spent such a long time in my father's office talking. And I wondered, what could they be talking about? And I said to him, I think I know what they were talking about. One thing they were talking about was Julius had said to Booker T. Washington, okay, I'll join the board of Tuskegee. I want to do that. What else do people need? Washington explained to him, they need schools. Tuskegee is fine, but they don't even have elementary schools. There are places in the South where there are no schools for Black children to go to.
Right.
And then he told him the thing that really sweetened the pot for Rosenwald, which was, he said, in these little communities, these people are already raising money to do this. They have almost nothing. I mean, these are sharecroppers. These are farmers.
Yeah.
These people have very little, but they know that their first priority is to provide education for their children. Mm-hmm. And so they're scraping together money. And he had files full of letters from these communities. So when Rosenwald made a donation to Tuskegee in honor of his 50th birthday, that's how he celebrated his 50th birthday, by giving away a lot of money. Mm-hmm. Washington said, how about if we take a little bit of that money and use it to help 6 communities right around Tuskegee build schools?
Okay, and that's where it started. Okay.
That's how it started. And Rosenwald said, okay. And so these 6 communities, each community contributed $300 and Rosenwald contributed $300.
Okay.
And they built the first 6 schools. And later, I can't remember exactly how many years later it was, but Rosenwald came down and visited the schools. And he was so impressed by the fact that it wasn't just students that he saw there, it wasn't just children, but he saw the whole community, the men and women. And to them, having this school was an affirmation for all of them. You know, this meant that they were going to, their children were going to have a better life than they had. And their children have other options. They wouldn't all be sharecroppers.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And I think that moved Rosenwald a lot. And so when one of the things that Booker T. Washington did, which was just brilliant, was he then ropes in the public school systems. Public education is mandatory throughout the states, but the southern states are dividing their money very unequally between the black system and the white system.
Yes.
And so Washington was able to say to them, look, I've got this guy in Chicago. He's going to donate money. Your contribution won't have to be so big. And so the public school systems become the third partner in this 3-way partnership: the communities, Rosenwald, and the public school systems.
Okay.
So Booker T. Washington sadly died in 1915, just as the program was getting started. But Rosenwald decided to continue it. And in 1920, he set up an office in Nashville, Tennessee, to run the school building program. And between 1920 and 1932, well, the overall total for the program was about 5,000.
Okay.
I can never remember the exact number, so I would say about 5,000. But it was an extraordinarily successful program.
Yes. I know of a school that was housed in the rural part of the northern part of North Carolina. I can't remember which county, but I remember there was, I think it's in Currituck County, North Carolina.
Kaintuck?
Yeah,
there's North Carolina had the most of any state. North Carolina had 850 Rosenwald schools.
I know they had that. Yeah. So I was
extraordinary.
That's huge. That's huge. Are you kidding me? That's huge. But I'm saying I know of there because I was reading about how they were trying to relocate this school because I have family and I have family in the area, and I was thinking I know about that. I said that was in the Rosenwald schools, and so they were trying to relocate it and keep and preserve it. So I just wanted to ask you, it's just I know the focus is about, but you think about the math in the North, in Chicago, wealth and so forth and so on, to think about the, education, how important education was for Black families. And like you mentioned before, these are people who had really nothing. And they felt as people, they feel if our children can learn to read and write and have an education, their lives will be better. And that's really the theme that I've said about, how, like I said, even every generation, it goes the same thing. So I just want to know if this is like a concurrent message. And it was interesting that you mentioned how he went and continued this after Booker T. Washington's passing. So that was a significance. What you learn from that? What did you learn from that?
Well, that this subject is larger than, this isn't a Jewish story. This isn't a Black story. It's an American story about everyone, and about, that belief in the importance of education that's a defining trait of our country.
Yes.
And actually, I read I have a memoir that a great-great-grandmother of mine wrote, and she lived in East Texas where there were no schools. And she wrote about how excited she was when a school teacher moved to town and she was going to be able to go to school every day. And it helped me understand that this was a universal craving. Yes. It was special for African Americans because they had been so specifically excluded from it.
Yes.
It was like the thing that you're not allowed is the thing that you want even more. Yeah. And what they did with it was so extraordinary because I've had the opportunity over the since my book came out, to talk to a lot of people who went to Roosevelt schools.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes. Oh, okay. Yes. There's a huge movement to preserve the schools.
Yes.
And so I've talked to many, many alumni, and they all report, it's interesting that they have such similar reactions, but they all talk about what a positive experience it was, how important the teachers were. And, you know, for Black teachers of that generation, teaching was a mission. It wasn't a job. It was a calling. It was a calling. And they felt like we're going to make life better for these children than it was for our generation. And it was inspiring. I mean, I've had so many people talk to me about, oh, I remember Miss Jones, or I remember Miss whatever her name was. She encouraged us. She was so strict, but she was so supportive.
Yes. But that's interesting, Stephanie, because that's the same thing I say about my third grade teacher. It was my first Black teacher. And I'd say if it were not for her, I don't know if I would be doing what I'm doing or whatever. I'm be honest with you. How she made you feel like you could excel and you could be the best that you could be was very, as a 7-year-old kid. I mean, I'm thinking to myself now, wow, I didn't realize at the time, but I'm thinking that really kind of inspired me to want to excel, to want me to be the best that I could be, because she really was like committed. It was a mission for her, like you just mentioned. It was like, oh, I'm just going through this. This is my job. No, she was adamant about making sure we were going to excel in excellence in the classroom. And that has continued with me throughout my whole life. And I think if I had not had that foundation, I don't know if I would be doing the things I'm doing or I've done over the several years I've been around. So I'm just saying to you, that just resonated with me when you made that comment about the Rosenwald graduates and how they felt that the teachers were on a mission, not just because it was their job to do it. And I thank you for sharing that, because I didn't think about it until you just mentioned it. I was like, okay, that was how long ago was that? How many years ago? Now I'm thinking that's how I felt when I was a young child. Not that it was a long time ago, but still, I'm just saying it's amazing that you make mention that the people who attended the Rosenwald schools felt that the teachers, they're on a mission to improve, to assist the lives of those children who were in the classrooms.
One of the women I talked to went to a Rosenwald school just near here in Prince George's County, Maryland.
Yes.
And the school was actually named for this woman's great-grandmother who had given the land that the school was built on. It's called the Ridgely Rosenwald School. Okay. And Laverne, my friend, said that her teachers used to say to her, "You've got to go out and be a credit to our race." And that was an attitude that a lot of the teachers had, that, you know, we're all in this together and we're going to, you know, be a credit to the race. And indeed, the generations that went to Rosenwald schools later were the generation that really became the backbone of the civil rights movement.
Yes, I was going to ask you that. Yeah, that's something.
And of course, you know that Representative John Lewis went to a Rosenwald school. Medgar Evers went to a Rosenwald school. I haven't quite confirmed this, but Coretta Scott King wrote in one of her memoirs that she went to a Rosenwald school.
Really? Oh, I was looking at that. And Alabama, really?
Yeah.
Okay, they had a lot of schools in Alabama. Yeah, that's
there were a lot of schools. And you know, we're also focused on the leaders of the civil rights movement, but the backbone of the civil rights movement was all those people who registered to vote, who supported the NAACP, who housed civil rights workers in their homes. And a lot of those people had gone to Rosenwald schools, and I think had absorbed a real message of sort of empowerment and citizenship.
Yes. And so that was crucial, because if they had not, then I don't think, as you're saying, I don't think we would have had that movement, quote unquote. Am I correct?
Yeah. I mean, a leader can't do it by himself. He's got to have people to lead. Exactly. And I remember when I was watching that documentary, The Eyes on the Prize, and I was looking. I was looking at the footage of people walking to work during the Montgomery bus boycott. And I thought to myself, this is Alabama. Some of those people went to Rosenwald schools, or their mother did, or their father did. They're connected with people who went. This was a part of their story, and that was an exciting thing for me to understand.
But anyway, I want to also, I want to take too much of your time, but I want you to just basically talk about what the continuation is now with the historical sites you mentioned that you're doing now.
Oh, that's so interesting. Well, in 2002, the National Trust for Historic Preservation named the Rosenwald schools as a group to their most endangered historic sites in America. because so these were all Black schools. When segregation ended over a period of 10 or 20 years, the schools became obsolete because the children who had gone to them were dispersed to white schools. And it was very rare. It was very rare for the Rosenwald school to become the consolidated school. It did in a few cases. But many of the schools, because they were very rural, a lot of them just either fell apart or somebody bought it. And there's a Rosenwald school in the northern neck of Virginia. Someone bought and stored hay in it, which turns out hay is a good thing to put in a wooden building because it absorbs the moisture and it preserves it very well.
Oh,
but so then starting in like the 1990s, there started to be a movement to preserve the schools.
Yes.
I'll just tell you one story that to me sort of encapsulates that. The first Rosenwald school I visited was in Rappahannock County, Virginia. Again, close to where I am.
That is, yes.
So there was a man who had gone to that school as a child, and he then moved away, and his career was in DC.
Okay.
He retired and moved back to Rappahannock County.
Right.
And he saw that his school was shuttered up. It wasn't a school anymore. Mm-hmm. And it had become the site of the county dump.
Oh, no.
Dumpsters. Yeah. So literally there's dumpsters in front of it. And he thought, that's not right. I think we need to preserve this. And so he started pestering people and got a movement going. And the county indeed removed the dumpsters. He got a grant. They got a grant to restore the school. Okay. And it's now the site for their senior center. And it's open to school groups come and visit. And so it was part of a movement that happened in a lot of different places where people said, we want to preserve this history because it was such a powerful example of communities coming together and doing something. The story they wanted to preserve wasn't especially the story of Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington, although that was very important, but the story of the community. And like my friend whose grandmother gave the land, people who came together and said, we can do this, we can make this happen. Mm-hmm. And in so many cases, they succeeded so magnificently.
That's great. That's great.
You possibly know this, that we have a new Smithsonian Museum of African American history and culture here in DC.
Yes.
And it's got on display a bunch of desks from the Hope School, which was a Rosenwald school in South Carolina.
Oh, really? That's where it was.
Yeah.
I've been there several times. I've seen that.
It's upstairs. It's on the second floor.
Yeah, exhibit. Yeah, that's interesting. But I don't think it has a note. Does it say it's from the Hope School?
Yeah, and it even has the original sign from the school.
Okay, I have to go back.
But it's a small display. It would be easy to miss. Next time you go,
I'll go again and make a note to make sure I seek that out. I've been to the museum at least 4 times already, and I always can find something.
No, it's overwhelming. There's a lot of stuff there.
Yeah, I mean, it takes you a couple of bits to actually go to the entire. But then when you go back again, they've got to add something else, so it's always something that, and it's also a learning experience as well for people. And it's amazing that I find that there are people who live right in the area who've not even stepped foot into that facility. I just can't believe that people who are actually there who live in the area who have not even stepped foot in it. And I think that's a lot. That's a lot. But like I said, people find ways to do different things. That's why I think the podcast is good, reading is good, books good. But we need to make sure we spread the word and let people know. Because if you don't know, how can you do anything better?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I have personally been incredibly inspired by this story and by the people that it's brought me in contact with. It's just been wonderful.
It's brought me in contact with you. Go figure, right?
Exactly. We might never have met otherwise.
Yes, otherwise we would just be at the table like, okay, because I knew about the school, but I told you, like, I have a relative who taught in a one-room schoolhouse in rural North Carolina. So I was aware of that kind of, one-room schoolhouse, but I don't know if it was a Rosenwald school. I have to know.
You know the name of the school?
No, I don't. I'm going to call. I have a cousin who has a lot of the history. He's much older than me, much older than me. And I'm going to call him and see if I can connect with him, if he can get the information and share that with me. Because I remember when I was a child, my mother would drive by. This is our cousin. They call her Cousin Katie. She was a teacher in the one-room schoolhouse. And that's why I know. And she would drive by. This was the schoolhouse. I said, "Oh, okay." And I'm a child. I'm like, "Okay, it's a schoolhouse." They didn't like the schools that I attended, of course, but I'm thinking, "Oh, this is a schoolhouse." So I'm saying to you, I have to now investigate to see, in fact, if it was one of the Rosenwald schools, because of course I didn't know at that time. So now, but of course, the house was torn down. By the time I knew about the Rosenwald schools, the house was torn down. Unfortunately, people don't understand the history of maintaining the heritage. That's a sad story. But I remember driving around. We would go through this rural area of North Carolina, and she would point out, this is the school your cousin used to teach at. I'm thinking, okay, so that's all I remember. But I have to investigate and see if it was in fact Rosenwald. Most likely it was, but I'm going to investigate and let you know. Okay.
Well, that'll be good. There's a very complete database of Rosenwald schools at Fisk University.
Okay.
Unfortunately, it's offline now because they're digitizing all their collections, which is a huge job.
Right.
But it's wonderful when it gets back online because you can Google state and then you enter your county and it'll tell you there were 6 Rosenwald schools in that county, and they'll tell you the names of the schools, and it's fun to do research that way.
That's a wonderful resource. Thank you for sharing that. So Stephanie, thank you again. I know our time is running short, but I want to thank you so much for sharing this information that people don't know about and didn't know about. And this way they'll know about and see if they can do something moving forward. But the significance was the fact that education is a key point, and everybody wants to enhance their lives by getting the education they feel they deserve to have. And I thank you for your distant relative who started the Rosenwald schools and was able to at least put that in and move that agenda, which led to so many other people having a more prosperous life in America. So thank you again for your presentation. Thank you for the guest here on my podcast, and I look forward to connecting with you soon again. All right.
I thank you. This was really fun.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And we have an episode of the Silk Stocking Sisters podcast. Again, enjoy your rest of your day, evening, or night, wherever you are around the world. Have a great day, everybody. Bye.